Adam, excellent.
Hey there.
There. All right, I hope everyone's back from a refreshing break for our second session of the day, which will be on pilots, the evidence base for cycling, and the democratic oversight of planning in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. Now, that's a whole mouthful. So what is this about? So while we were talking more about infrastructure in particular areas of the city in our previous session, I think we're going to focus a bit more on the process of infrastructure decision-making in this session. So the facts are quite clear, and there's a lot of evidence out there that supports cycling policies, and supports the implementation of cycling infrastructure. We know the benefits for health, for climate, for traffic in general, for mobility, for quality of life. But despite all this information, a lot of information as well on the impacts of cycling infrastructures, it still seems to be hard to get these projects implemented to really enact change. So kind of what is really the tension between having all that evidence on one hand and on the other hand, the process being so difficult? And particularly in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, there have been more and more calls, or repeated calls, I'd say, for more studies. We need more information. We need better data. We need more. We just need more time to figure out if this is actually working. So these kinds of calls, like this anti-bike lane group, Keep Toronto Moving, who we were talking about a data-driven vision for Toronto's bike lanes. So what does that mean? And do we not already have a data-driven approach? So yeah, these are kind of characterizing the conflicts around bike lanes, is kind of these claims around what is true, what are the facts, what are the impacts, and yeah, the validity of the data itself has often been the bone of contention. And on the other hand, Toronto is also very a characteristic of Toronto, particularly compared to other places in the world, is that bike lanes seem to have to pass through really extensive piloting phases. And so this is a practice that was already common in Toronto before the pandemic, but has really been scaled up during and after the pandemic. And many of these projects, like the young bike lanes in Toronto, just pass through really extensive pilots that can be extended again and again. And one more season, we need more information, we need more time to test it out. So the theory is that this gives us more time to adapt the projects, to make them better, to improve these infrastructures. But seen more critically, we could also say, well, this is actually just deferral, delay, and gives more time for these projects to actually be shot down next year, or if the political winds change, and they haven't in Toronto, they haven't, but this dynamic could have been a lot more negative if things had gone differently in the recent election. So I would like to invite our speakers of the day to talk about these relationships between data, politics, and the decision-making around cycling projects in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. Now, I know that our speakers are all focusing on Toronto or have specific experience in Toronto, but I do hope that these discussions also are relevant to other jurisdictions within the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, and indeed wider in Ontario and in Canada more generally. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Zarah, if you're okay with going first. She's a PhD student at the Faculty of Health Sciences of Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, but she's a Toronto native who has been doing research on Toronto's pandemic time bike infrastructure, particularly their equity impacts. And as a health researcher, she has kind of turned to more of a policy research approach, if I may say so, Zarah. So please go ahead and take the floor.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Thank you for organizing the session. Thank you for that awesome introduction. Just so everyone knows, I didn't send Thomas anything ahead of time. That's all from just him paying attention over the last little while and getting to know each other and listening to my research, which is really nice. I do have a couple of slides just to keep everyone on the same page, so I might go ahead and share if that's okay. Okay, how does that look? Is everyone seeing slides? Awesome, great. As Thomas said, my name is Zarah Monfaredi. I'm a PhD candidate at Simon Fraser University, and I'll be speaking today about my doctoral research focused on COVID-19 street reallocations and lessons that I've learned through conducting interviews with municipal practitioners. I will say that I'm speaking to you from the unceded and traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. But as Thomas said, although I live now in the land that we call Vancouver, I grew up around Toronto and have been back and forth in the last little while quite a bit to conduct my research. So I'm very familiar with the context of the city. And before I talk about my research, I want to be really clear about what I mean when I'm talking about street reallocations, just because depending on the context, depending on the city, they might be referring to different things. So for my work, when I'm thinking about street reallocations, I am talking about three types of infrastructure in particular. So first, lane closures for active transportation, like the one seen here in Montreal. I'm also talking about quiet and slow streets. So these are things that you might also hear referred to as slow zones in some cities. This is where local traffic is allowed to pass through, but folks would be warned that they're sharing street space with cyclists and pedestrians. And then lastly, I'm thinking about new bike lanes and paths like the temporary one seen here in Toronto, and you can see the orange pylons on the side there. Oftentimes when people think about street reallocations, they also think about street cafes and outdoor dining areas, that sort of thing. For my research, I'm focused on these three in particular, just because of their explicit impact on active transportation. So like I say, I conducted interviews in spring of 2023 with municipal practitioners about the impact of COVID-19 street reallocations on decision-making processes related to active transportation. I did conduct my research in 3 Canadian cities, so Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, but of course today I'll just be speaking to the Toronto context. So in spring 2020, Toronto had approved the accelerated installation of 40 kilometers of on-street bike lanes. And this map here shows in red where the street reallocations were implemented, and in black where the pre-existing cycling network existed. So you can see in some areas connections were made, particularly in the downtown core, and then some additional street reallocations to extend the existing network. Now, in preparing for this panel, Thomas asked us to think about some key questions, some core questions to guide our talks, and 2 in particular really spoke to me. So the first was about pilots and temporary measures, and did they facilitate experimentation? So what we know is that timelines were expedited during the pandemic, and cities told us that they had to focus on getting something on the ground as quickly as possible. And so pilots were this really great way to get agreement from council and to move forward and trial something new quickly under these tight timelines. Also, we know that materials were not widely available and continued to be hard to come by in the months after following the pandemic. So cities really just had to use whatever materials they had available. And so like orange pylons and repurposing things that they might have used for street festivals and things like that. And then lastly, in traditional decision-making, public consultation does take a long time, and we heard that this can slow down projects. And so this was a way to allow people to trial something and see if they liked it or not. And so from one of our participants in Toronto, we heard them say, I think the interim bike lanes helped along with public engagement. It sort of forced people to provide feedback, and they did provide feedback, a lot of feedback. What was maybe forgotten in the excitement of the expedited timelines and seeing all these new things on our streets was the need for maintenance. And so using temporary materials meant that cities could move quickly, but it also meant that materials were movable. and residents were able to make changes to their own neighborhoods, which in theory is great, but sometimes was unsafe. So we heard a participant say, because we had to put street allocations up quickly and we knew it was going to be temporary in a pilot type nature, you know, we had things like barrels on the road, and people hated that because they got moved around. They got hit, they got stolen. The second question that I think that my research speaks to is what potential exists for new technologies and techniques to improve community outreach. So the pandemic did allow for online consultations, and what we heard was this actually allowed cities to hear from a wider demographic of people, for a wider demographic of people to show up and participate in council meetings. And because of that, practitioners were able to see more support for active transportation infrastructure than they would have pre-pandemic. So COVID-19 did introduce technology into the public engagement process. In the GTHA, we did hear that the accessibility of online consultations allowed for a different demographic of residents to speak. And I really like this quote because it speaks to sort of this important lasting legacy and the excitement of the time. So I think the more important legacy of the pandemic for active transportation is the shift to online consultation. If any one thing changed the most, it's that young people can now be talking about their support for bike lanes while breastfeeding. Like, when have you ever had the comfort to chime in for a public meeting? Don't turn your camera on, and one of you is putting the kids to bed, and the other one would be listening for your chance to say you really want that traffic light. So I'll finish with some key takeaways. Pilot interventions were used during the pandemic to respond quickly, and municipal practitioners had to be innovative and turn to temporary materials to provide the much needed space that folks needed during that very intense time. But I'd say that pilots are not a one-size-fits-all solution to urban planning decisions. So it is very important to allow residents to provide feedback ahead of project implementation rather than this flipped style of engagement where you implement first and collect feedback second. Of course, this is part of the democratic process of decision making, and it's important to make sure that interventions are aligned with community priorities. And then the pandemic did also allow for online consultations, but I think that cities should obviously be aware that not everyone can access the internet or technology, and that might be a barrier if we were to move to online consultation only. And so I think there is still a need for in-person consultation. So I will stop there and look forward to everyone's questions.
Thank you so much, Zarah. And there's certainly many things we can still learn from the pandemic, and a lot of lessons that we might have learned the wrong way that we have to reevaluate what we took away. So certainly lots to reflect on. So yeah, just going in the order I have it here on my Word document. Madeleine is our next speaker. She's a Data Sciences Institute postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto, did a PhD in physics, and is now working on transportation. So that's a rather unconventional path to cycling research. So spends her time thinking about bikes and programming, and runs an excellent Twitter account commenting on mobility issues in Toronto, I must say. Madeleine, please.
Thank you so much, Thomas. This has been a wonderful seminar, and I think what I'm going to talk about fits really nicely with both the morning and what Sarah just shared. So I'm really glad to be going in this order. Oh, I need my toolbar. Okay, how does that look? Can people see slides? Okay, so yeah, as Thomas said, I'm kind of new to this research area, and it is truly a pleasure to be working on something that I was already thinking about all the time. And it's amazing to be here, and I'm very happy to tell you about what I've been working on. So I think the aspect of pilots that I'm going to talk most about is kind of how data is used and what types of data we could be thinking about when we think about building new infrastructure. And I want to emphasize that some of this data has been used by the City of Toronto in as a factor in their decision making. So I don't have to tell you this. We all know that cycling is a great way to get around. It's becoming increasingly important as cities have these climate targets and goals. The city of Toronto has a goal of having 75% of trips under 5 kilometers made by sustainable modes by 2040, which is coming up pretty quickly. Here's some people biking in Toronto on the left. On the right is my son and my friend biking in Ottawa, where I lived for 3 years. And these are both protected, separated from cars, cycling infrastructure. But as we also heard this morning, there's many places in Toronto and GTHA that are not comfortable or safe to cycle. And these are photos from Danforth Avenue heading into Scarborough from a group ride I was on. This is actually Thomas here. And, you know, if we weren't in this group setting, we'd be biking on a 4-lane road with mixed traffic, fast vehicles. And this is very uncomfortable for most people to experience. And so what we want to think about is, how does the state of the infrastructure that we have and the layout of the road network and the physical infrastructure affect who can get around and where? And then can we quantify these factors in thinking about where new infrastructure will have a big impact? And the framework that we use in my group to think about infrastructure and how useful it is called level of traffic stress. And this is based on surveys of adults that showed that really very few people who are willing to cycle, so less than a third of people who would bike at all, are comfortable sharing the road with cars. So either on a painted bike lane, which we call level of stress 3, or in mixed traffic with multiple vehicle lanes and fast cars. On the other hand, most people who are willing to bike will kind of only tolerate protected cycling infrastructure, so physically separated from vehicles. And at the very highest level of physical separation, we can say this is also appropriate for children, something that you might also hear referred to as all ages and abilities cycling infrastructure. And so I want to bring in, I'm going to also talk briefly about the COVID-19 bike lanes. So this is work that happened in my group before I joined, but I want to highlight it because it talks about how we use this framework of level of traffic stress to understand the impact of infrastructure. So like Sarah mentioned, Toronto added 40 kilometers of bike lanes. I think that's 20 center line kilometers to be consistent. And so that's shown in red and pink here. And I want to also highlight this one here is the Brimley Road bike lane that ended up being removed. That was mentioned by Marvin and Andre this morning. And so what our group did was look at how these bike lanes changed what destinations people could access using only low stress roads and paths. So we're thinking now about actual connectivity and can you get from point A to point B without having to leave this low stress network. And I want to just highlight 2 results from this paper. One is the change in the access to jobs within a 30-minute radius of biking using only low stress, so level 1 or 2 stress roads and paths. And for a relative North York at the top. And again, this is the Brimley Road bike lane that was removed. So there was, you know, even though, as Marvin said, it's not connecting a lot of things, there was still this change in people being able to access some things they couldn't access before. And so this is starting to give this idea of the destination that you measure and the way that you quantify the impact is going to affect what you perceive as the result of the impact of these changes. So our group used this metric, how many destinations you can access on a low stress network within 30 minutes to think about, can we predict where new infrastructure will have the biggest impact? So this is a model that was made by Bolin, a PhD student in our group. And in green here is shown a solution from this model. These are the sections of new bike infrastructure that would maximize the increase, the accessibility to jobs in Toronto. And I want to point out, I'll say this in a minute. So just to take a step back and zoom out and look at the whole city, this is the level of traffic stress map for the entire city of Toronto. I'm showing arterial roads as thicker lines here. And broadly, blue and green is low stress, yellow and red is high stress. And if you kind of, you know, fuzz your eyes, you can see that there is this trend of more low stress infrastructure downtown. So when we have this perception of cycling as a downtown thing, and as Nancy mentioned first thing, you know, the original cycling plan was really a downtown specific thing. And that's still borne out in the way that we have infrastructure now. And in particular, you know, if you look at arterial roads in Scarborough, North York, and Etobicoke, they're almost all high stress. And what does this mean for expanding the network and how we evaluate that? oh, I also want to say before we get there, when we think about access to jobs, this is a map of the current state of accessibility to jobs within 30 minutes using only low stress roads in Toronto. And anywhere that's white is a 0. So there's actually no accessibility on low stress roads for those places. And you can see that accessibility is much higher downtown than in the surrounding areas, both because of the density of destinations, but also because hugely affected by the transportation network itself. And so when we run this model to predict where new infrastructure is going to have the biggest impact on accessibility to jobs, we find the model suggesting infrastructure that's almost all downtown. That's these gray pieces here. So if we're going to add 90 kilometers of infrastructure, the model says, yeah, build it here. This will provide the biggest increase. So what we also wanted to ask is, this is there's a historical context of how we got this infrastructure in Toronto. What if we instead divide this problem into smaller regions of Toronto? And we chose to use the pre-amalgamation boroughs of Toronto. And instead of solving this problem for the entire city, which was giving us this really downtown focused expansion plan, what happens if we solve a separate, smaller problem for each of these regions? So what I want to show you now is we've taken this 90-kilometer expansion budget, divided among each of the 6 regions, and then I'm going to show you the combination of projects that those regions would maximize accessibility for each of those regions. So first, East York, I'll just keep going here and add the rest of the infrastructure. And what I really want to point out is that if you look at the combination of all the colored projects, which is the same amount of increase, but just now divided amongst these regions, it ends up being more spatially spread out. So you get things being pulled more into the surrounding parts of downtown Toronto than just clustered right near downtown. And there's some interesting ones here, like this teal one going into Etobicoke is Bloor Street, which the city has, I think, just approved to build. So that's really exciting that this is predicted to be very important for accessing destinations, and it's very important in particular for Etobicoke. So that's one kind of spatial measure of the difference in thinking about this framing, but can we also quantify how this is impacting the level of access for individual areas? So what I'm going to show you now is the number of small geographic regions, we're using census dissemination areas, the fraction of the total dissemination areas that meet some threshold of job accessibility. And so a job accessibility of 1 here would be if you could reach every single job that is recorded in the census in the city by biking on low stress roads, you would have an accessibility of 1 here. And just because we're cutting it off at 30 minutes, nobody can actually get to 1. But this is what it looks like before we do any optimization for new infrastructure. We see that most places meet some lowish threshold, and very few origins actually meet a high threshold, even up to somewhere like 10% of the total. When we look at the results of the 90-kilometer budget optimized over the entire city, we kind of see this boost evenly across the range here. So there are some areas that had low access that now more of those areas pass this threshold, but also areas that had high access get even higher access. And so maybe when we're thinking about equity and accessibility, there is some limit to how much you actually need, and we shouldn't be thinking about giving more access to people that already have such high access. Now, in contrast, the combination of projects where we prioritize each region separately has a little bit of a different pattern. And what was exciting to us was that we see more origins passing the threshold at this lower end of the range than at the higher end compared to this citywide optimization. And this is relevant because this is actually in the range of the original median accessibility. So the mean is already much higher than the median, which means that there's a huge range in starting accessibility, but that by prioritizing individual regions, we're able to give more of a boost to origins that had kind of a more median typical level of access before, which is maybe a more kind of relevant range to expand things in. And so to conclude, we're trying to think about, and we're seeing evidence of this idea of an equity efficiency trade-off, where if you have more access for regions that have initially lower access, the overall benefit is lower, but it does mean that you get this more even distribution of accessibility to destinations. And so where all this is going, everything I've told you is still kind of using this utilitarian framework where we're trying to maximize the benefit that we get, whether it's in a small region or in the entire city of Toronto. And so we're moving towards, we have some results that are still preliminary, but thinking about how can we directly prioritize the areas that had the lowest original accessibility. And this matters because when we look at also patterns of marginalization in the city, as was mentioned in the morning, we see that there are marginalized groups on the outskirts of the city that have really low access. And so on average, they tend to have worse accessibility by cycling than areas downtown that tend to be less marginalized as well. So I'll stop there. These are my advisors that I work with, and Bo, who made the model that I'm working with as well.
Fascinating always to hear you speak about your research, Madeleine. Very advanced physics almost with cycling, but certainly gives a different perspective, which is what we're here to talk about, different perspectives on cycling, something that, you know, you don't usually use to think about cycling when you come at it from a different perspective. I think this is what you look at a lot of the times. So our next speaker will be Adam. Adam Hasham is Senior Advisor at Metrolinx and an experienced transportation policy and public engagement professional. He was closely involved in evaluating Toronto's active TO initiatives during the pandemic, so we'll be able to reflect on similar themes as well. He has a Master of Cities Master of Cities Engineering and Management from the University of Toronto. Adam, may I invite you to present, please?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas, and thanks, Zarah and Madeleine. It's nice to see some familiar faces, some of you Léa, who taught me in that program, and Nancy and David, who I did some of that work with. So hopefully I won't contradict too much of what you've taught me and won't bore you at the same time. So I am actually a transportation engineer by training, but I ran citizen panels and did public engagement for a while before working on the active TO pilots. Also co-chair Charlie's Freewheels, which is a small community bike organization for youth in the downtown east. But I worked on election campaigns and now I teach. So I have a bit more of the kind of theoretical policy bent to some of this that I'll try to bring. I don't have any slides for you, so you'll just try not to get bored by the sound of my voice. So both of you have already spoken about some of the active TO pilots that happened in Toronto. A few of them that I worked on were the Destination Danforth project, which was already sort of in play. The couple major road closures on Lakeshore Boulevard, and there were some similar ones on Bayview, on Black Creek Drive, Allen Road, and the Meadoway in Scarborough, as well as the one, Thomas, you mentioned on Yonge Street, and then one that's still kind of ongoing, which is the Eglinton Complete Street. It's kind of a follow-up to the Eglinton Crosstown project. So don't hold my current job against me. So just to give you a bit of a level set on some of those pilot projects and the studies that we did on them. I think in the initial days of some of the complete street studies, there was a big focus on safety and latent demand for cycling. So the Bloor Street pilot, which I didn't work on, but Nancy and others did, also focused heavily on safety and self-reported feelings of safety, but also on impact to businesses to prove that this wasn't going to be necessarily a hit to businesses along Bloor Street, using some transaction data from I think the city has access to. There was good evidence that it wasn't, and so there was a little bit of getting over that initial hump of people feeling, fearful of what cycling could do, not just to traffic, but to business, which has been and will always be in Toronto a big hindrance to any sort of policy. It is the business improvement area fear or the resident association fear of what could happen. So that was kind of the origins of it. We've kind of moved it over the years to looking at gender as a proxy for safety. So if different genders are reporting safety, there's good evidence from around the world that says the best cycling cities are ones where different genders cycle at equal rates and feel safe enough to cycle at equal rates. We kind of shifted there. And then we started moving to doing kind of pre and post studies so that we could compare whether, people observed it, whether we observed a mode shift, right? So people starting to take up cycling more, get a little bit more granular about where that latent demand was by neighborhood, and basically prove that most people, as we know, are just multimodal people, and they make appropriate decisions about time and cost and what they need to do on a daily basis. The big shift from where initially we were just saying these bike lanes are safe or safer than they were without them, to now the Eglinton report. I think that the first line is, transit access and cycling access are equity issues tied to, whether you're a low income individual, tied to your gender, whether you have access to a vehicle, that's a gendered issue in most households. So a pretty big shift in the data that we have been collecting and reporting on. I would say these studies have fundamentally focused on the immediate community and have sort of, without anybody really noticing, initially at least, defined the community as the people who spend their time on the street and not those who just travel through the street, which is a pretty big flip of what, transit engineers or transportation engineers would normally consider. So you might not be fully capturing latent demand that's out there that, people aren't getting to the street, but you're talking to people who already frequent the street, and it has been somewhat defensible to say those people who are already using that neighborhood and frequenting those businesses, those are the ones who are in favor or against, and we can make adjustments based on the actual community. So yeah, it was a little bit unnoticed, I think, at first. I think on Yonge Street there's been more discussion about that, and it's worth getting into. I think what the city hasn't done very well is haven't really talked about their broader policy goals. So they haven't talked about, greenhouse gas reduction, haven't talked about health impacts. And some of that's okay in a short pilot. It's hard to measure all of those. They're more complicated. It would be a very expensive study if we did that. And I'm okay with that. We've shied away for good reason from talking about purely physical activity, the benefits of physical activity and, impact on speed and that sort of thing for vehicles, which on Bloor, there was research that said, the vehicle travel time increased, but the city was okay with this sort of trade-off there. It wasn't astronomical, and it was kind of appropriate to the intervention. What we really do need, I think, is a far less parochial approach to planning, or at least implementation in Toronto. So the city's current cycling network plan is an infrastructure plan. It is not an articulation of policy goals. Say the complete streets policy is the closest thing that you can point to as a kind of coherent, every department articulation of policy goals. But barring that as a first step, what happens is we let the loudest community members decide what the issues are every time there's a pilot. And then we simultaneously decide what data we want to pursue. And it is based on the previous study before it, and trying to build. If you look at the Yonge Street study, it compares safety on Yonge Street to reported safety on Danforth, which compares reported safety on Danforth to Bloor. And there is some way to keep some of the data consistent and measure across time. But at every pilot, what we do is we let the loudest people decide what we value as a city. And to me, it's a completely backwards approach. So we've tried to preserve what we think is valuable: safety, gender equity, those sorts of things. But the city has, quite frankly, abdicated its responsibility to articulate some policy goals. And that could be different by community council or by secondary plan or something if you needed it to be. But I would say, rather than having a pilot that goes out and figures out what its purpose is every time, we should understand what our values are and what our policy goals are, and every pilot should fit into that. And the success of a pilot shouldn't be so different every time. So I think we're getting better at that. I will say, okay, so I'll be a little cliche and maybe steal some of Brian's and others' fondness for the Netherlands. There is a much stronger focus on network planning for cycling routes, separate from network planning for vehicle routes. And I think, I don't know if it was Andre put up the Greenway network plan that he worked on. That like gets to in Scarborough an idea of what a network plan that is focused on appropriate cycling routes could be. Right now, we're trying to just pigeonhole or not pigeonhole, but we're trying to just tack on a little cycling pilot to a regular street plan, a regular kind of traffic planning, and I don't think it's working. I think some of the panelists in the morning also spoke about, just integrate minimum standards for different types of roads, such that when you resurface one or you redo a streetscape, you've got an appropriate level of cycling infrastructure that you're going to implement in certain cases. It doesn't need to be necessarily every road in the city gets the same upgrade, or that frankly all of them get an upgrade all the time. But when you are going to spend a lot of money and you're going to do some capital works, certain types of streets, there is an agreed to minimum standard such that we are not interpreting every single time what we need to do. So that's a bit. I will say then lastly, and then I'll stop talking and we'll take questions. I think what happens is, and Thomas, you asked us about, data or sorry, new kind of technologies that we can use to gather data. What we've seen with the city is because of this approach, different resident associations and business groups are hiring their own engineers and their own planners and their own lawyers, and they're getting their own equipment to monitor traffic in some cases. That is not great. That means that everybody's free to interpret their rules on their own and collect their own data, and then we need to balance that with the centrally gathered data and explain why, well, your guy didn't look at that thing, or you're missing this, or actually, like, what we just need is we need a transparent articulation of our goals. Everybody should be fitting into that. All the pylons should be fitting into that. Again, if they're different by different region or community council or what have you, that's fine. It is really ad hoc. I think there's value in being flexible, but we will lose trust in the process if every time it is at the whim of a different group. And it really does feel like every time we have an idea, we make things a little bit better. So one good example is people on Yonge Street were particularly concerned about whether fire and EMS services would be able to navigate the street. There are a lot of seniors' homes. There was a little bit of concern. And so we literally just asked them this time during that study. And there's a paragraph in the report that says that they didn't observe a significant difference. After that, the city published some stats that I think said for fire services, it was a 8-second increase in average response time. And for paramedics, it was a 36-second decrease. So functionally, no impact of the pilot. That's a great step, but it shouldn't have to be ad hoc. There should be a list of departments that are involved every time, a list of policies that are touched on every time. And maybe that's a little bit asking too much, but I've actually seen the number of pilots decrease since, and the appetite for a decrease. And I think in a way, we have missed the, never waste a crisis moment of the pandemic. Coming out of it, because we didn't have a standardized process and plan, and we still don't have one, barring, the city's cycling network plan. We're not really making good use of the progress we made, and we're kind of losing a little bit of momentum, if I can be so cynical. So anyway, I'll stop there, and hopefully that was enough opinion to go on.
Thank you, Adam, for those very interesting reflections. We were entranced by your observations without a presentation, but that made I think us focus even more on what you were saying. I think you made a lot of very good points, very interesting points for the discussion. I would invite everyone in the audience to please add your comments to the chat. We'll be monitoring that. But while we wait for specific questions, it's up to me, I guess, to tie these presentations together, tie these different points of view together. And I guess one of the key questions I found during my research, but also based on your presentations, is how does data relate to the making of policy decisions or of infrastructural decisions? So what kind of information is actually necessary? What are policymakers, what are planners actually asking for? How can researchers contribute to that, or what does the city itself kind of generate that actually responds to specific needs? And I'm kind of thinking about the political uses of data here. So Adam, you just mentioned the response times of emergency services, and I think the issue of economic impacts of bike lanes on the Bloor Street study is a rather famous example of that. So how does data relate to the kind of the political needs of decision makers? Perhaps to not go straight back to you, Adam, Zarah, could you kick us off kind of talking about how this worked during the pandemic?
Sure, that's a really interesting question. I'm keen to hear what Adam has to say, because I think I can only speak from a research perspective and what we heard in our interviews during the pandemic. I think a major factor in the decisions that were made during the pandemic were pushing forward pre-existing plans. So decisions that had already been made and already approved by council were the interventions, were the bike lanes that made most sense in the pressing context of the pandemic for the city to move forward with. Now, in terms of data and availability of data, we know that demographics information shifted a lot during that time. And so to Madeleine's point about equity and accessibility, decisions that were made pre-pandemic maybe didn't fit the demographics that we were seeing during the pandemic and beyond. And so I think it speaks to the length of time that it takes for interventions to be implemented on the ground, and how much shifts in neighborhoods in that time. And so anecdotally, we heard during our interviews, for instance, about public consultation. A lot of folks were saying that traditionally this took a long time and delayed implementation. And so the data that they had collected during public consultation related to people that no longer lived in the neighborhood once the intervention was actually implemented. So it's a really good question, Thomas. I don't necessarily have an answer, but it certainly did come up in our interviews, sort of this delay of implementation.
Just to quickly pick up on this, Madeleine, this LTS instrument, it's rather fascinating. I had my own run-ins with this tool in some planning efforts and research efforts I was involved in previously in other contexts. But what could the use of LTS be to justify certain interventions over others, and particularly those kind of using an LTS analysis, but with particular goals and indicators, as you were showing us before? Do you think that is something that's easy to explain to a wider audience, or is it more of a technical tool for within the Department of Planning?
Yeah, that's a great point. I forgot to say this, but the reason why we use it is because it's been shown to correlate, or the accessibility to jobs on a low stress defined with LTS network in Toronto correlates strongly with cycling mode choice for commuting. So the research community does think that it's a way to relatively with accessible data that we have, assess whether people are likely to actually change their behavior or actually likely to cycle. So that's why, research community uses it, and the city has used this. So for example, with the Yonge Street Midtown pilot, the one of the points in their decision making was the change in accessibility on a low stress network, and that was done by the group before I joined. So it's not the only factor by any means, but it is one of those points that, like Adam said, in this case they used this other data point that they didn't have before. And we're still talking with the city about how they might use this going forward and what kind of aspects, but I think it's definitely not appropriate for every context, and it's not the only thing that affects the experience of cycling. This is really meant to kind of crudely capture, am I going to die or not on a particular route? It doesn't have anything to do with weather or hills or shade or anything else that affects people's behavior. And as your research that you mentioned shows, it's maybe not appropriate in other locations in the world. So it's developed with this kind of North American focus. We have evidence that it seems to work pretty well in Toronto, but that doesn't mean that you can use it everywhere. But I think for talking about GTHA, it's a really great addition to kind of bolster this argument that connectivity is important and that we need to think about functionally what the infrastructure is actually allowing people to do.
Can I want to jump in there, Tom. So sorry, the accessibility measure here is really interesting because we use that for, so accessibility, not in terms of physical accessibility, but in terms of right access to jobs and services. We use that for other things. We use that for transit planning. That is one of the fundamental things we do when we talk about a business case for a transit line. It is this going to get people travel time savings? Is it going to get them within, you know, a reasonable distance of a community service? So we tried to do that on some of the, I think, you know, Danforth and Yonge Street in a little way, but it was mostly self-reported access. So that, yeah, it's odd to me that it isn't applied to cycling planning. And this is where I'm being a little firm with the city that they and every city that there's a question in the chat here about whether we need a strong policy framework for pilots. Like, it's kind of insulting that we don't. It's been too long at this point that we can't articulate. You can't keep pointing people to, well, go look at the Vision Zero document, go look at the official plan, go look at this, go look at that. Like, just write down 10 principles that you care about and focus everyone's attention on them. And they will be applied in different contexts as they are appropriate.
Excellent. Thanks for that that observation, Adam. You already picked the question I was going to ask you next. Just to review here. Okay, so there's a question regarding the top priorities for cycling infrastructure in the region, but just to kind of link that to some of the themes that came out of your presentations, particularly Madeleine's presentation, and that is there an optimal cycling network for Toronto? Does such a thing exist? What would be optimal in your eyes? And based on what data can we say that a certain strategy or a certain project is more ideal than another? Open floor.
No, I don't think there is an optimal network. Even if there was, we can't build it instantly. So there's always this question of time that Zarah mentioned between deciding to build something and then actually implementing it. You know, the city has their network idea. They have an idea of what their ideal network is, but they're not, you know, they can't build that tomorrow, just even if they really wanted to and devoted resources to it. I think most people would agree that connectivity is important and that being able to actually go places you need to go is important. And I think that those to me really represent and capture the functional benefits of cycling networks. So I'm always coming back to this as one of the most important things we can try to, you know, get data on and make quantifiable. But I also wanted to say that, you know, I think there's a very practical problem, which is that the city has, you know, told us that they don't have the ability to actually construct what they want in the first place because they're waiting for the road resurfacing unit to decide what their priorities are. And so the reason why it looks patchy and gets implemented patchily is really this very practical problem. And so maybe we need much bigger changes in the order of decision making and the prioritization of resources if we're actually going to get something even close to optimal, whatever that is.
Adam, may I rephrase the question a bit for you? You were mentioning the articulation of various policy goals. So just to maybe put some words in your mouth, an optimal cycling network would target all these objectives that the city has, you know, supposing that we think those are good. And I think we all agree that the policy targets in place, yeah, are generally laudable. The question is how to get there. So how would that articulation look like in practice? Does that mean more reliance on data or more of a strategic approach, or kind of how does that relate to each other?
Yeah. So I don't think it's a complicated articulation. Like I really do think it is moving away from a plan that is purely what do we want to build to why do we want to build it and what does good look like, and the outcomes can be things that are pulled from some of these pilots. Like, okay, I shouldn't be so harsh with city officials. Some of them are good friends. Like, there has been a lot of work done, and they have worked within an administration that is not really so creative here, and to do a lot in a short amount of time. But now I'm losing my train of thought. But I think we can pull from some of these pilots that we've done. We've done a number of them now, and they tell us things like we can measure what good cycling infrastructure looks like based on impact to community, impact to business, based on gender equity, based on whether people of color start cycling, whether people consistently cycle. Like there is data about how often are you using these pieces of infrastructure. I won't be prescriptive here, but there are those pieces, and then there are pieces that are in the city's existing policies elsewhere that are not necessarily coherently applied, is what I'm saying. So the city has a number of other policies, and again, without like this could become exhaustive, right? You could have a reconciliation policy applied to this. Like that's fine. The city just needs to decide what its maybe 5 or 6 objectives are, and then give people a way to apply them. Because what I think, unfortunately, what happens is, and you were just talking about this, Madeleine, I think, like the data gets used as a crutch, but we know that the process is corruptible. On Black Creek Drive, Zarah, you mentioned like very easy to set up some of these pilots with pylons or whatnot. On Black Creek Drive, when they closed it for a COVID active TO major road closure, they had police vehicles with their sirens on half the time closing down the road, and people thought it was a crime scene instead of a cycling route. Like that colors the data. The weather was bad. That colors the data. If every time we need to justify where the data is coming from and whether it's valuable, instead of having an agreed, appropriate set of priorities and principles for collecting good data, we will be in a much stronger position. Same thing on the Medaway. Medaway is a kind of a greenway under a hydro corridor in Scarborough. It wasn't actually a real road closure, but the city wanted to study it in the same way. And what they found is it was a marketing failure, right? Like nobody was using the greenway more during COVID just because you put up a pylon that said active TO roadway. So yeah, like again, that doesn't get factored into what is our process for this pilot. Every pilot has its own people working on it, its own quick, gathering of materials and marketing, and it is very corruptible if it is not somewhat standardized. I don't know if that answered your question.
Thanks for those reflections, Adam. It was very, very, very useful. So just for our final question, there's a question from Cassie Smith regarding the consultation process. And Zarah can probably best speak to that in terms of what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, in particular focusing on the equity aspects of consultation. And if I may, I'd like to add one more element to this question, which is that it seems to me that in the Toronto area, it's really up to the local councillor to decide what gets to fly in their local district. And so how does that kind of make it difficult to have more equitable bike networks, or perhaps also equitable consultation processes?
Oh, Cassie, that is a $1 million question. I really like the question. And I think there's a lot of different ways to slice it. So again, I'll refer back to the pandemic and what we learned during that time. For me, a major learning, I think, we did ask our interview participants about equity, and we heard a lot of folks say that it was difficult to consider equity during that time. And in our conversations, what was becoming clear was that the way in which we're defining equity is different between people, and the way in which we're measuring it is very different as well. So Adam spoke to measurement, and I think that's a really good point. I think traditionally there's been a focus on distributional equity, so making sure that there's a solid distribution across neighborhoods. What I think when we were speaking to folks during our interviews, when they were saying, oh, it was hard to consider equity, they're referring to recognitional equity. So thinking too about different identities of people, who is living in the neighborhood, why might they cycle, why might they not cycle. So capturing more information about the people rather than the distribution of resources. How that applies to engagement processes. Something that we heard was sort of in like a pro and advantage of these pilots, letting people experience interventions and then collecting feedback and changing them in an iterative fashion meant that folks who use the cycle path or the bike lane for getting to work or for their day-to-day activities were able to provide feedback, whereas normally in traditional settings, consultations happened near the intervention, and so that would be capturing people who live near the intervention, and those people are maybe not the ones who use it every single day. So I think there are lots of different things to consider, and I think that your point, Thomas, about council and councillor decision making, I think councillors do have responsibility to the residents that they represent. And so that point about, well, who actually uses the infrastructure for day-to-day activities, that might be different from people who live very near the infrastructure. And so we need to be thinking differently about outreach, about how to meet people where they are, and about how to collect opinions from voices that are not traditionally at the table.
Thank you so much for that, Zarah. I'd like to invite Madeleine or Adam, if you'd like to comment, about a few minutes left in the session on this kind of issue of, well, I guess, equity in consultation processes, but also the role of local councillors and kind of local politics in enabling networks to actually expand in an optimal fashion or not.
I can jump in on the equity and consultation. So in my past life, I said I was a director at a firm that ran public consultation about thorny issues where there was no technical answer. And there were judgments and value judgments to be made. So there are large processes that the city could undertake. That is a giant randomly selected group of citizens that function like a jury to make some policy choices where government, feels like it's too complicated for them to do so. The alternative, which is probably more likely what they will do, is that they will have much more targeted meeting people where they're at. So you talked about online surveys and that sort of thing, but in addition, they're the kind of doing a site visit before you decide what the study looks like is incredibly valuable. So we found that there were a lot of food delivery workers and made sure that there were specific focus groups for them. And, maybe not your typical idea of who is equity seeking, but ultimately there is a lot of overlap with those same groups. Seniors groups who have particular accessibility needs. Like, it isn't to say that we shouldn't involve particular stakeholders in the process. We just need to make sure there is a representative who can be involved in some sort of meeting people where they're at, and those things are not very expensive, so they fit in line with the kind of idea of running small pilots, and there's small focus groups that go along with that pilot, and all that data gets fed into it. I think it is meeting people in the community groups where they already exist. So Danforth East could have been done better, where there are already the neighborhood group and folks like that who could have been involved. But it just, like, again, so core principles and then context specific additions to that, and core principles that speak to a few ways we could evolve our pilot process.
Thank you, Adam. Madeleine, I'm afraid we're out of time for this session. Everyone's we all deserve our 10-minute break before the final session starts. Thank you so much, Madeleine, Zarah, and Adam, for your interesting presentations and your viewpoints, responses to all these questions. I think it's a very important topic to keep thinking about, this kind of the process of decision making. How do we improve our information? How do we improve our consultation? How do we get people the right information and kind of figure out which tools can improve all these processes. And I think there's a lot of technological solutions, but it's also a lot of people work. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Please do take a break. We'll be returning at noon with our final session on the just cycling city, with a contingent a bit more focused on other GTA municipalities. We'll have various people from Hamilton, as well as the Toronto area. So I'll invite you all back at noon for that final session. Thank you very much.